So we will put that on YouTube shortly after this webinar. Just to let people know, there's a chat function, so if you would like to ask questions during the session, we will be delighted to receive them and answer them. You'll find the chat function at the bottom in a little bubble. If you click on that and submit your question, we will take as many questions as we can during the webinar, and then any others that we can, we will pick up and respond to you directly. We've taken sustainable development in its widest sense, in the sense of environmental sustainability, financial and economic sustainability, and also social sustainability. And we are joined by our three panelists, Ed Jackman, Natalie Day, and Fred Portimay. Ed Jackman is one of our senior partners in the strategic land team, and he specialises in acting for developers and particularly landowners in the assembling of large sites. We're also joined by Natalie Day, who is from our housing association background, and she will be talking about housing association and sustainable development and social sustainability. And we're also joined by Fred Portimay, who is a planning specialist, and he will be speaking in detail about the latest planning changes. I can see some notes that there's some feedback and some issues on the sound system. We will try and resolve those as we go. So, to start straight away, we are planning to talk about 4 areas: strategic land and site assembly, sustainable infrastructure, and social sustainability, and then we will come on to planning. So to start first, it would be great if we could turn to Ed. Ed, would you be able to give us a bit of a brief roundup of how things are working in strategic land and what the changes have been since we last had our webinar back in April?
Yeah, hopefully I'm clear. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you.
Good, good. So I just thought I'd touch on a few things that have happened, particularly since sort of lockdown started and April onwards, in the sort of world of options promotion agreements for residential, occasionally commercial developments. And I think there are 4 things that I've noticed happening, sort of trends in the market. I think the first is that if it wasn't the case already, there is a lot more caution amongst developers and promoters about minimum prices in option and promotion agreements. So certainly we're now seeing much lower minimum prices than we did a year ago, and there's a lot of caution on those. There's a lot of desire to have minimum prices only based on net developable area rather than gross area or gross and net developable area. And so that's a trend I think that's been around for a year or so, but is definitely accelerating at the moment. The other thing that I think could change things quite a lot is capital gains tax. So we've had this sort of very favourable regime now for about 3 or 4 years, where most landowners are only paying 20% capital gains tax. In some cases, they were only paying 10% because they were managing to get entrepreneurs relief. That went down from memory from 28% in about 2015 or 16, I can't quite remember. But the Chancellor's announced he's reviewing capital gains tax. The Labour government always said that they thought capital gains tax should be at the same rates as income tax. And there is a feeling, particularly in view of the amount of money the government need to raise, that we might see capital gains taxes or higher rate capital gains taxes being matched to income rate taxes. If that happens and landowners are paying 45% on their gain, then entering into option and promotion agreements is going to be less attractive for them than it was, and some of the ones who've already entered into option and promotion agreements are going to get quite a nasty shock. So I think watch this space on that one. we've already had the entrepreneurs relief at 10% limited to £1 million. So that happened in the last budget. And I think if we see capital gains tax rates go up, that could have an impact on the market. And I think there's a general feeling that the best days for landowners may be over, because with sort of double dipping on community infrastructure levy and Section 106 agreements now in many areas, there's a feeling that values are going to be driven down and tax is going to go up, but we'll see. A couple of other points to make about what's been happening since April. I would say there's even more, if it's possible, I think there's even more difficulty in getting things done in terms of complex and large sites than there was before the lockdown. So whether that's delays with the planners, delays with professionals, whatever, I think it's, you know, what was a snail's pace anyway on the larger sites is now dipping below a snail's pace on many of them. And then the other thing I think that's very, very interesting and either pleasing or worrying, depending on which side of the fence you're from, is that I don't think we've had many open market valuations or promotion agreement sales since March, April. There are certainly options coming up where planning permission is going to be granted soon, and we'll have a valuation date, and then there'll be an agreement or a determination on the price based on a valuation date in the second half of this year. That's going to be interesting, because I think at the moment no one quite knows where values are and what independent experts are going to say about market value. And similarly on promotion agreements, you know, in the second half of this year, I think we'll see more sites actually come to market, and it'll be much clearer what the position on values is post-March, whether there really is a dip or not. So I think very interesting times ahead. I suspect we won't really start getting any idea of the position till the end of this year, as sort of news filters through of deals or valuations that have had to be done in the second half of this year, but we'll see. So anyway, I think they're the main developments from the work I'm doing. So I shall happy to answer any questions on those at the end, or anything else for that matter.
We have one question, Ed, relating to conditional contracts and options. In particular, we're seeing more conditional contracts, whereas traditionally plans have been purchased for development through options. Really, what's the difference between the two? Which seems to suit a development where, you know, you're going into a clean site without any previous planning history best? Would you be able to run us through the main differences and perhaps where a conditional contract would be best and perhaps where an option would work best? Well,
I mean, the question, whoever's asked it, it's a big question and it's a big issue. And it's becoming more and more of an issue because, you know, a lot of the easy sites, the single ownership sites, have been promoted, planning permission obtained and sold, and we seem to have increasingly a mixture of very difficult sites left with multiple landowners. I think, and this is a massive, massive generalisation, generally, if a house builder is trying to put together a multi-owner site, option agreements, it's easier for a house builder to do it on option agreements than it is for a promoter to do on promotion agreements. And there are lots of different reasons for that. But you can still run into huge difficulties, and I've got plenty of those difficulties now, where you have option agreements with multiple landowners. And you know, the best way in terms of actually getting from A to B and getting a planning permission and getting the land sold, the best way from that perspective is probably for the landowners to form a consortium, enter into a formal consortium agreement and grant one option to one developer, so that, you know, everything can move forward under one option agreement. The moment you try to have things moving forward under lots of different option agreements or different promotion agreements, even if they're seen with the same developer but with different landowners, then you will almost certainly run into trouble. And you know, I could name you 5 examples of that in Wiltshire alone, of sites that are in real difficulty because of different landowners under different option agreements. The problem is that landowners now and landowners agents are very keen on promotion agreements, and you know, there's a lot of tension on option agreements when it gets to the price agreement and determination, and there's a lot of people out there who feel very aggrieved by what they've got under an option agreement and what their neighbours got under a promotion agreement. So, you know, there is a sort of landowner desire for promotion agreements, but you know, there is no easy way to do it. But it's a quick answer to your question. Does it make the process longer than simply granting an option? Well, I think it's harder to do on promotion agreements with multiple landowners than it is on option agreements, but it can be done under promotion agreements. But I think the key to doing it on any site is actually for the landowners to form a consortium together and act together and have as few agreements with a promoter or developer as possible. As soon as you start having lots of different option agreements or promotion agreements for one site, life becomes very, very difficult.
Thank you very much. That's put us quite neatly on in terms of landowners needing to work together and developers needing to work together in terms of land supply and in terms of the delivery of developments to start looking at infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure. In terms of what's happened with sustainable infrastructure since April this year, legislatively, fairly little change. In terms of site acquisition, with I think bedding down in the new SARS changes and with the new arrangements, and generally dealing with the market. I think the market and understanding of how sustainable infrastructure and particularly ensuring that sites are increasingly self-sufficient in terms of particularly drainage is maturing. And we are certainly seeing that with better input on things like studs, with much greater emphasis in the early stages of land acquisition to making sure that sites are identified and the drainage strategy both identified and secured in terms of arrangements for Section 104 agreements and developers being confident that they will be able to secure an adequate Section 104 agreement for both drainage connections to the plots and also for surface water drainage of things like state roads. And also ensuring that all relevant planning conditions relating to any stuff are dealt with and being much more aware of who the statutory consultees will be. So that's kind of what I've seen happening in terms of sustainable infrastructure. Natalie, it would be great if we could sort of have a brief chat. We've got a question here about infrastructure. The emphasis of making sure developments are appropriately surveyed and structured has shifted from statutory providers much more to developers. How are options and conditional contracts picking up on that, and how are they responding to the challenge, and are we seeing any further changes? Natalie, do you want to sort of jump in and offer us any nuggets on that?
Well, certainly. Oh, am I?
We can hear you.
There you go. Excellent. Well, yes. So as you say, kind of the process is changing, and there are different ways that we are looking to do that. So you've mentioned some of the kind of things that developers have been doing, where developers are looking for kind of longer option terms, or wider deductions, or minimum price clauses. The counter to that is obviously landowners are looking for some extra latitude for what they want. So they're looking from developers who are wanting a greater input in the planning process and wanting to be more involved in the sites. So while you've got kind of developers, because everything is involving people working far more together, because there's so much more emphasis on sustainability and the project as a whole, because developers want more, you're also getting landowners that are looking for a greater involvement and looking to kind of have more of an input than they may historically have wanted to have.
Ed, can I ask you a quick question on this and ask you to come in? One of the issues that developers are facing is needing to secure third-party land rights and possibly start arranging utilities and services and drainage on site. And I know that potentially brings with it tax implications for landowners. Would you be able to give us any insight on that? Ed, can you hear me? I think we've lost Ed momentarily. Just to go back over sort of what Ed has been speaking about CGT, there's a risk of increasing landowner CGT liability if you start servicing a site. So moving on, Natalie, we know that physical connectivity and coherence within developments and within landscapes is absolutely essential in creating sustainable neighbourhoods. But obviously land is generally bought in discrete parcels, and landowners don't necessarily want to see themselves being burdened with too much infrastructure.
Sorry to interrupt, Rebecca.
Yeah.
You're kind of quite distorted on your sound. I don't know whether it may be worth going in with Fred possibly, because it's quite a struggle to hear the questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I thought I fixed it while we were online. Delegates, my apologies. I will just run next door and I will bunk up with Fred. I will not be a moment.
Hello there. I hope you can all hear me better now. My apologies for the problems with sound. I thought we had resolved them. Yes, so Natalie, we were...
The question again.
Yes, of course. So physical connectivity and coherence within planning landscapes and within built landscapes is incredibly important in creating sustainable development socially and physically. However, landowners aren't terribly keen to see their sites unduly burdened with lots of infrastructure. What's your experience lately of trying to deal with that, and what sort of solutions are you seeing at this sort of option and contract stage to try and deal with those challenges?
Well, thank you. What we've come across recently is options like making completion of options linked to implementable planning permissions, because obviously you've got a lot of kind of situations where they need to make sure that the infrastructure and services are available on the site. And so it's trying to create a mechanism that you can make sure the land is tied up and the land can be acquired, but that it's protected, that you can actually continue to build the development. So yes, one option would be to kind of have options linked to implementable planning permissions. Also kind of, and I know you've mentioned SUDs earlier on, linking to kind of having surface water solutions in place. So you can have it so that the completion is linked to the point where actually you have your service connections and those solutions available. And in fact, we've come across a number of options at the moment where completion is conditional upon third-party land rights having been granted. So you can see a real shift in actually making sure that the physical development out of the site is actually able to be achieved, and it's not just kind of land that's acquired, it is actually the development and the achievable development.
Yeah, in terms of ensuring that landowners get their fair share, particularly if their parcel of land might have been perhaps a little undervalued at the initial stage because it's been burdened by extra access road or access into backland where it's not entirely clear what the use of the backland will be. I've generally also seen quite a lot of overage used ransom strips are the obvious answer as well, to just hold that land back or hold an interest in future. And also with options, we're seeing sort of greater, as you say, landowner involvement in the planning process, but also sort of an obligation that, you know, any access road into a development, if it is required to connect into a neighbouring development or, you know, potential development, is not given sufficient capacity in the planning application to ever be the primary access into a neighbouring development. So very much the emphasis is on connectivity rather than sort of initial access. So yeah, okay, that's great. Well, Fred, I can turn to you now. Fred has had the monumental job in the last few days of trying to get his head round all of the new planning. Or are they to speed up the economy and its recovery?
Firstly, I think that the importance put on sustainable development, on good infrastructure and strong neighbourhoods isn't a new thing. It hasn't come out of COVID. You can look at the NPPF for a definition of sustainable development, but that goes back as far as PPS 1. So I don't think that COVID has caused a planning focus on sustainability. Secondly, I think that it is clear that the government has positioned development as a key driver in economic recovery post-COVID. It's no accident that building sites were among the first thing that they wanted to get open again to get the economy moving. In terms of the details around the reforms that have been coming out recently, there has been a lot of tinkering as well as some more fundamental things. I will probably cover them in more detail later. The one thing we are really waiting for is the white paper, which we were told was coming before the end of the month, and I was frantically worried that it was going to come either yesterday or today, and I was going to have to spend my whole day reading it, but thankfully I've avoided that bullet. It's still pending. Finally, on speeding up delivery, I think there was some reference to new counting in Prime Minister's announcement on planning reforms at the end of last month. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that I'm not sure any of the changes that have been made so far are going to undermine or affect the environmental protections that are in place. Indeed, the indications around Brexit were that we were going to incorporate the environmental protections into our own legislation and keep them there. Whether that flows through or whether the Prime Minister was indicating a change in tack there, we wait to see.
Oh, thank you very much. There we go. We just share the screen. I've had another question in on green infrastructure, actually, which we'll take. It seems to be an idea that is gaining traction and seems to be very much embedded in a number of local authority policies. Can you tell us what green infrastructure is and how it differs from normal sub-solutions and amenity areas?
So green infrastructure can be anything that provides an environmental benefit. The PPG, in fact, defines it as a space-line asset that provides environmental or wider benefits and gives a list of what it can include: parks, playing fields, open space, woodland, as well as drainage features or other blue infrastructure, streams, ponds, canals, and that kind of thing. So I think it encompasses rather than differs from SUDs. I think it's also worth highlighting biodiversity net gain and the importance that is going to be put on securing improvements to biodiversity and environmental conditions on planning permissions going forward. That is something that is a talk of itself. So unless there are any specific questions on it, I will leave it for another time, but just to flag it up.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So moving on to social sustainability, as we know, socially mixed neighbourhoods are absolutely essential to and have a huge impact on physical and mental well-being, educational outcomes, and the general wellness of developments and communities. Natalie, would you like to give us a sort of brief roundup of the changes that you've seen since April time?
Certainly. Well, England needs 340,000 new homes, including 145,000 affordable homes until 2031 to meet the current demand. This includes 90,000 for social rent and 25,000 for shared ownership. So there is a massive housing need. As I'm sure you'll all be aware watching the news, Boris has announced the most radical reforms to the planning system since the Second World War recently. And this includes the promise of significant investment in affordable housing and affordable housing programmes. So through the following questions, we'll look at some of the additional queries this raises and some of the current unknowns.
So one of our first questions that we had in before the seminar started actually was, how do you think Boris's build, build, build package of reforms will enable RPs to respond to the challenges of needing more affordable housing in the face of some economically harsh conditions? Do they offer any particular gifts to RPs?
Well, £12 billion has been proposed to be kind of put to the Affordable Homes programme to support up to 180,000 new affordable homes over the next 8 years. There's a bit of background negotiations, I think, as some reports say 5 years, some reports say 8 years. But actually how that money is going to be kind of filtered down into housing isn't entirely clear at the moment. So we obviously need greater, they need to give us greater details on that. It's not clear whether that'll be through going to councils, so maybe to help with some of the Section 106, and that ties in with the first home schemes, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or whether it's going to be more through grants and through Homes England. But they need to make sure, I mean, one thing that does need to be careful is that actually this money is available and this money does get filtered down to help the building programmes. Because Keir Starmer flagged in one of the debates that the government's 2015 Starter Homes initiative promised 200,000 affordable homes and had 2.3 billion allocated to it, but it failed to produce a single home. So there is clearly, we need to understand the details of how this money can be unlocked and how it can actually help with building the additional homes that are so needed.
Okay, thank you very much. So moving on from that, part of the announcements that were made on the 30th of June were the proposed pilot for the 30% perpetual discount for first homes within the first homes pilot. How's that going to be implemented? Do you have any information on how that's going to work moving forward?
It's fair to say details are rather sketchy at the moment. So it was first proposed in February, and First Homes is a tenure that's designed to make homes ownership available for first-time buyers, and it creates a 30% discount that then stays with the home kind of every time it's sold on. So the new pilot that's just been introduced will see 1,500 units delivered at this discount. What we understand from the government at the moment is that it's going to be funded by Section 106 contributions. So that ties into questioning whether some of the funding is going to go to the kind of local authorities and the planning to give the extra funding for Section 106, although I suspect not. The plans, so that's one route that has been suggested. The plans have received some criticism, with people concerned that actually the net effect of putting it on Section 106 contributions is that you're going to get a reduction in affordable housing delivered through Section 106 schemes. So it'll be very interesting to see how it's implemented. I mean, clearly it is a fantastic thing to actually have a kind of provisions to be able to get first-time buyers in, because you need to get that to get the economy moving and to get it flowing. But it'll be very interesting, and slightly watch this space, and we'll be able to give kind of a better update when when more information comes through from the government.
Fantastic, thank you, Natalie. And then just moving on, in 2019, or I suppose looking back, Legal & General announced that it's partnering with 14 housing associations, and it was seen as the way forward in social housing. It seems to have been a bit slow to take off. Do you think the economic downturn is going to give that a bit of a kickstart and get more private investors invested in the market, or do you think it will have the opposite effect?
Well, I mean, the kind of slow start, I mean, clearly we've been going through a slightly uncertain market. We've had Brexit, now we've got COVID. There's been a number of factors which can make investors feel a little more nervous about investing in different sectors and about the value of housing and the value of their investments. I do think it is a very interesting area, and probably one that is going to move relatively quickly, because you've got, especially if the government decided to incentivise private investors to actually invest in it as being another way of getting money into the sector, then it will become a much kind of bigger, well, benefit to people. There's also a greater diversity of lenders entering the market currently. In fact, very recently, and since our April update, so in June, Legal & General have just announced that they're going to provide 100 million in deferred long-term financing to Bromford Housing Group. The funding will be drawn in 12 months' time and will support Bromford's strategic development goal to deliver 12,000 new affordable homes by 2028. So Legal & General are very much saying that this is kind of both to serve the communities and to play an important role in getting the UK economy back on track. So there is an investment, there is a kind of a drive to actually go into this market. So it is something I think we will see more of. I also think it's worth saying, and linking into the sustainability side, is that you've recently had the paper on environmental, social and governance factors, and investors are very interested in investing in those ESG markets because they could give reasonable financial returns at a time where actually interest rates are non-existent at the moment. So they are looking at different avenues to actually get some investment back. In fact, Gordon Moore, the Chief Investment Officer from Homes England, has stated that affordable housing is uniquely placed to meet investor objectives, especially given its clear focus on social outcomes and rigorous governance. So the social housing sector already has that. So I think we will be seeing more investment and kind of a greater interest in affordable housing going forward.
Fantastic, thank you. So I guess now it's time to turn to planning. As we already know, there's been a lot of new announcements, both in terms of keeping the planning system working during the COVID crisis, but also using planning and construction generally to hopefully kickstart the economy and improve productivity. So rather than asking Fred to give an update of everything that's happened since April, I figure we're probably best just plunge in. So Fred, over to you, the new proposals. Would you like to give us a roundup?
As I said, the government although there has been talk of a fundamental shift to the zoning based, there is and the talk about the most radical reforms since the Second World War. We haven't seen the detail of that yet, and it's hard to say that it's definitely going to be that radical until we see the colour of the government's money, as it were. There have been quite a number of smaller measures introduced in recent months. Some have been designed to limit the impact of coronavirus, and some have been very much with a view to recovery. I guess we'll start with the changes that were made quickly during lockdown with a view to limiting the impact. We saw temporary changes to introduce flexibility in the food and drink industry, to allow takeaway operations, to ease restrictions on temporary use of the land. And we've had guidance and later legislation on easing conditions around construction working hours and changes to publicity and notification processes that were all designed to allow the system to function and the pipeline to keep flowing. Following that, there have been a series of changes to the GDPO. It was only 5 years ago that the GDPO was consolidated, and since then we've had a substantial number of changes. Broadly speaking, the recent ones fall into a small number of categories. First of all, we've seen the development focused ones, i.e. the ability to put additional stories on blocks of flats. This week we saw the detail of the ability to build up to 2 stories on top of private homes. We've also had announced an ability to allow a wider range of commercial buildings to change into residential use. And again this week, details of the demolition and rebuilding PD right. Interestingly, on the same day the most recent PD rights came out, we had the government publish its report on whether PD conversions deliver attractive dwellings, and the conclusion was quite clear that the kind of dwellings that come out of PD conversion tend to be the small ones that have, in the words of the report, a negative impact on amenity and mental health. So whether or not conversions are part of building a sustainable community remains to be seen. There's been a question asked, and I was going to talk about it here anyway, about the changes to the use classes order, which I think are perhaps more fundamental. We saw this week an introduction of a new Class E and Class F to the use classes order. Class E is your general commercial business space, and largely replaces classes A1, A2, A3 and B1, and takes them all into a single class, which means that changes of use between what were separate classes before will now not be development. That degree of flexibility, I think, will make a difference to delivery of more sustainable places, help high street recovery, or certainly focus on high street recovery. Class F is sort of social infrastructure, community infrastructure, and it seems it's been created mostly just to take those elements outside of the PD rights. The question that was asked was whether or not the use classes order runs alongside PD or separate from it. I think that answers the question. It runs alongside it, but because they're new classes, there are no PD rights attached to them at this stage. I mean, I'm sure there are other things I could talk about. The other things that the government have introduced are, we saw the business and planning bill, which is serving to extend the time periods of planning permissions that were going to lapse because of COVID, and they will be extended until April next year. It will have a retrospective effect when it comes into force in September, so it will cover planning permissions that were going to lapse from earlier this year. There's a additional environmental assessment step involved in ones that have already lapsed. And the other thing the Business and Planning Bill does is allow a flexible approach to planning appeals. So up to now, we have either written representations, hearing or inquiry. The Business and Planning Bill will allow inspectors to pick and choose the elements which work best, which again is probably one of the more fundamental reforms to the system, and it will hopefully speed things up. And I think we've all experienced delays due to planning appeals, and this can only be only be good news.
Great. We've had a further question on planning. So Fred, initially, COVID has accelerated the pace at which some waning environments and building uses have become obsolete. Have the packages of changes announced on the 30th of June, or the changes that were already on hand, are they going to help us enable us to repurpose those areas quickly? And what do you think the further challenges are to doing that? In particular, what mechanisms are in place to make sure that replacement uses are actually sustainable? For instance, retail space appears to need repurposing, but pleasant outdoor space doesn't often come hand in hand with retail environments.
Yeah, well, I think I've just mentioned the use classes order and the fact that that's a high degree of flexibility to otherwise commercial spaces and allow flex from retail to general industrial. And I think that will help. That flexibility will inevitably help revitalise high street uses. In terms of delivery of sustainable development, I'm not sure that I think that the plan-led system, which is integral to planning, has always had sustainability at its heart. Where you move into permitted development and taking elements out of the system, history does show that it has a negative impact. You end up with these changes of use developments, which, as the government's own reports say, deliver negative outcomes. And so I'm not sure that taking things out of the planning system will actually deliver more sustainability. It will increase flexibility and allow those changes to happen quicker, allow a more reactive system, but I'm not sure that that is inherently more sustainable.
Thanks very much for that. We've had a few more questions from the floor. First one for any of the panelists who wish to jump in is, how will more working from home affect sustainable infrastructure in future, and how do we prepare for it on site? To jump in from my own experience, I think the COVID crisis has shown us that we need to have decent, livable, pleasant neighbourhoods for people to live in, and if the distinction between home and work is going to get increasingly blurred, then we need to ensure that both environments are practical and pleasant. So I think we will see a lot more emphasis as we go through developments, and particularly at planning stages, and more requirements from local authorities to ensure that there is green infrastructure within developments and that it's reasonably accessible. So that's kind of my view. Fred, do you have anything to add?
I think that working from home will drive consumer change, which will, in the long run, drive developmental change. But I'm not sure. I talked a minute ago about the flexibility and the ability to react quickly. I'm not sure that the system as it is set up now necessarily allows for it to happen quickly, and the world might return to more what we're used to in the time it takes to actually make changes that will see home working affect sustainability of town centres. But perhaps I'm more pessimistic on that than I could be.
It will be interesting in with what Rebecca was saying, whether there's kind of there's obviously quite a focus on relatively high density housing to get the amount of housing that's needed. It'll be interesting whether that density of housing is reduced because actually there's more of a focus on needing kind of a bit more space around, kind of as a result of people being stuck at home following COVID. So yes, it'll be interesting.
But
whether there is a knock-on.
That is one of the things that the report on what PD conversion dwellings look like was quite clear on. There's compared to units delivered through the traditional planning system, there's very little outdoor space. There's very little compliance with national space standards. They're delivering small places with no amenity value, and if people continue working from home for a long time, they're just not going to want to live in a place like that.
Yeah.
And whether that means that we move away from PD conversions into a planning-led scheme, we'll see.
Ed, can you hear us okay? It would be interesting to hear from you, Ed, from the landowner's perspective, what concerns landowners would have with sort of increasing green infrastructure and an increasing emphasis on placemaking and a greater emphasis on space within each development and within each house, even to how do you think that will play out with landowners?
Well, I mean, you know, most not all, but most landowners, I don't think are hugely bothered about what gets built on their land after it's sold. And I think their interest in that will only be that, you know, if it reduces density and reduces the price, they won't like it, but they may have to live with it. And I don't think, you know, I don't think very few landowners will look at it beyond that equation.
Thanks for the insight. That's really interesting. We've had a question in from Kev Draper. Do you foresee existing retail class falling under PD into student accommodation? Because of course students are the obvious market for town centre accommodation. Fred, do you want to jump in on that first?
I guess the caveat everything with it's a fool's game to predict what the government are going to do. We are waiting for a white paper which we're told is radical and we're told is going to introduce fundamental changes to the system. Until that comes, who knows? The PD system is very much a product of our current planning system, and it may not be carried forward at all into what the government's idea of radical reforms look like. Whether I think the government's focus is on delivering homes rather than delivering units of accommodation, and so I think they would rather see conversion into C3 dwellings rather than into student accommodation. But that's just my sense. So I'm not sure I do see a change of use for student accommodation from retail coming soon, but I might be wrong.
Thanks very much. And just to jump about a little bit, I think we've got time for one last question. Ed, I think this probably is for you, Natalie, and I. Developers need to sort out infrastructure on their sites before buying them, but landowners are less able or willing to engage with the process. I know there's really good reasons from the landowner's side why that is the case. Could you run us through, you know, the potential dangers for landowners in allowing infrastructure arrangements to start happening before development, and we can talk about possible solutions.
I think, I mean, when the questioner says sort out infrastructure arrangements on their sites before buying them, if they mean why does the landowner not want them to start work on their site before they buy it, the main reasons for that are they won't want them to implement the planning permission, because even if they've got an indemnity from the landowner, they won't want the liability for the SIL and the 106. Particularly in the promotion agreement scenario, if works are done on the land before the landowner sells it, then if works are done on the land before the landowner sells it, there's a danger of the landowner being seen by HMRC as actually trading in land and being taxed on an income tax basis, not a capital tax basis. So that's a big concern. And then in terms of putting in place certain statutory agreements, particularly some section 278, 38 agreements, those can contain obligations that apply even if the planning permission is not implemented. So if the landowner doesn't end up selling his site, he may not particularly want a section 278 agreement stuck on it, you know, regardless of whether it sells or not. So they are some of the reasons, but if we're talking about actual works being done on site before it's sold.
Yeah. Thanks very much for the insight there, Ed. It's certainly something that crops up for developers on a regular basis. We touched on it at the start of the webinar, talking about, you know, only exercising options once third-party land rights have been secured. And of course, we have to be careful to make sure that you don't encumber land with rights before you're ready to proceed. A number of developers have sort of taken different approaches, but one that seems to be fairly effective is to sort of enter into agreements to grant that are conditional upon the acquisition of the property. It carries with it its own risk in that the developer doesn't necessarily have a great interest in the land at that point. And obviously there's the cost implication of negotiating all of these. If, you know, something comes along at a later point that makes planning unfeasible, or that delays the development, and the contract with the third-party land owner expires. But there are some means of putting in place conditional arrangements that then don't imperil the landowner's tax position. So I think we've probably covered as much as we can in the hour that we have, and we have to be quite strict about our timings, unfortunately. Apologies for the sound difficulties we had at the start, and thank you for bearing with us. Hopefully it wasn't too off-putting to see Fred and I on one camera looking as though we've had a row, and that we're trying to stay away from each other. Thank you to our panelists who very kindly gave up their time and have shared their insights and their expertise. And thank you particularly to everyone who's tuned in and borne with us while we had those initial problems. We will be writing up notes of this webinar, and we will be circulating them as an e-shot to everyone that has attended. If you want to forward them on, please do feel free to do so. And if you have any questions that I'm afraid we couldn't get to all of them, do feel free to email us, and we will screenshot the questions as well, and we will try to include them in our write-up. I think that leaves me nothing else to say, but thank you once again. Take care and stay safe, and we will speak with you all at the next webinar.